And then I'll just ask if you've come, let's please sign in. Let's see, I'll take that right out of there. I think I still need to create a new tab, but that'll go real fast. Wait till I make in April 19th. What's today? It's still 2022, right?
Classic.
It's not saving. There we go. Rename. Who wants to be first? There you go. Oh, hi, Lily. I see you there now. My bad. I was typing. Thanks for coming. And is that the Ken Davidson from the EPA Vegetative Barriers Guidebook?
Yes, it is.
It turns out this has been thought about before. Let us learn from some history, perhaps.
So Matt, I'm not sure, are we going to start with kind of the whole health discussion? Is that what we're going to kick off with today?
Yeah, I think so. So why don't we do a quick round of introductions and we'll say who we're here with. And then hopefully we can go to OEHA and EPA to just talk about vegetative barriers and to give you just a quick bit of background. Then I'll clam up and introduce myself. Ken and Lily, we got money to plant trees. And a number of us on this subcommittee want to make sure that we're planting trees in a way that can be evaluated so that we can say this tree did something for this sensitive population that we're working on. And so in an ideal world, we would tie those forestry strategies to a comprehensive community level air monitoring record or data set. And we don't have a lot of that. Stockton's a categorically understudied community until AB 617, but we do have one sort of plausible or tolerable opportunity around All Saints Academy here in the study area that was fortunately host to an OEHA biomonitoring study that has indoor and outdoor PM monitoring, as well as a healthy dose of passive air sampling and biomonitoring data. So we at least have an idea of what air pollution indoor and outdoor at that school looked like since December. And so there's at least somewhere that we can satisfy what I think is a smart request to try to prove that these trees do some good beyond. I mean, I'll settle for an investment in my community. You guys could buy us, extra street signs and I'd be grateful for it. And I know that a tree anywhere is a good thing, but I think this thrust to prove that we can improve air quality at a specific place is important, and it'll help us further down the road if we start taking a look at specifically this school site. It was at least where we left off the last conversation. So happy to entertain other sites, but or anybody else that has indoor, outdoor air quality within the study area. So with that, I'm Matt Holmes with Little Manila Rising. I'm the Environmental Justice Director, and I do run an urban forestry program on contract with the city of Stockton through the state, the Strategic Growth Council, which has very similar goals with the urban greening and the vegetative barrier goals listed in our measures and our SERP. I prefer masculine pronouns, and I'm grateful for you all to show up and take an interest in Stockton. And with that, I will pass it to Miss Stephanie Ng.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Ng. I'm an air quality specialist in the Community Strategies and Resources Department. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll go ahead and pass it to Ned.
I'm Ned Leva. I'm a resident. I'm on the steering committee, and I'm on the Citizens Advisory Committee of the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. I'll pass it to, I see, Margot Prowse.
decade.
Hi all, I'm
And I
Margot
bring that
Prouse. I'm a
perspective
resident
and
on the
that passion and
CSC
dedication to
and
my role
chair
as
of
a
the
commissioner on the
Sierra
Housing
Club
Authority.
locally.
I'm
And
really
I will
proud of
pass
the
it
work that the
to,
Housing Authority has done since I've been on
I
the
see
board of
Richard
commissioners.
Braxton.
Sorry, Margot, somebody's got their sound on in the background and they're off mute.
Yeah, that's been going on the whole time. I wonder
They
what.
got their housing authority on. Maybe you can pick
The
one screen today.
who are currently there are a good team. I think we work well together and set.
Is that you, Margot? Are you listening to it? Feel
Biggest driver of
I'm sorry,
housing
what?
development.
Margot, you have an extra tab open that's watching the housing authority meeting on your browser.
And the
Okay,
Housing Authority is responsible
okay,
for
let
pumping
me
more than
figure that out. I apologize. I thought I shut it all down.
All good. So sorry, I can't remember who you called on, Margot. Let's move it along. I'll just pick Mr. Richard Blackstone.
I'm Richard Blackstone. I'm with Peace and Justice and Council of Governments.
And moving right along, how about C. Tao? If I got that right.
Thank you. Good afternoon. C. Tao. I'm with the San Joaquin Valley Air District and Air Quality Specialist. And I'll move it over to David.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Lopez. I'm a supervising air quality specialist here at the district in our grants department, and I will pass it over to Catherine Tao.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Tao. I'm the Senior Air Quality Specialist in the Grants Department at the San Joaquin Valley Air District. I'll pass it on to Aaron Tarango.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Aaron Tarango with the Air District. I'm a program manager of the Air District, overseeing all this stuff here, along with David and the staff along with us here. And Jessica, I guess. There you
go. Sure. I'm Jessica Olsen. I am the Director of Community Strategies and Resources, overseeing AB 617 implementation and coordinating with our other departments who you mostly hear from today on the incentive side. And Stephanie works on my team. With that, I will pass it to Scott.
Hi, Scott Wall with the California Air Resources Board. I am the AB 617 liaison to the Stockton community. And with that, I will hand it over to Susan Hurley.
Hi, I'm Susan Hurley. I'm a research scientist with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and I'm one of the researchers who's involved with the study of air filtration at All Saints Academy in Stockton. And I'll pass it over to Lily.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see some of you again. I remember some of you from a recent onboarding meeting and some of the community meetings. I am a toxicologist with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and I work in the Community and Environmental Epidemiology Research Branch. I will pass it over to Brian Moore.
Oh, thanks, Lily. So hi, everyone. I'm Brian, and I work with Scott in the Office of Community Air Protection. But previously, I am actually a respiratory physiologist, and I worked in the research division at a CARB looking at the health impacts of air pollution. And with that, I'll pass over to Mary Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Mary Elizabeth. She, her, a human being on this planet that is very interested in making things better.
And who do we have left? Our guest from the USCPA.
Thank you, Matt. Alejandra.
Hi, I'm a UC Berkeley student, and I'm working on a project this semester supporting the tree subcommittee and working with Matt Holmes.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you haven't introduced yourself, maybe you can raise your hand and that'll move you up to the front of the queue so we can figure out who's here. With the machine there, Sydney. The robot button under reactions, raise hand. That'll let us know who's left. Yeah, go ahead, Sydney.
Hi, I'm Sydney. I'm working with Alejandra on the UC Berkeley projects.
I think that's you, Ken.
I didn't know if I needed to raise my hand or not.
It's chaos out here, Ken.
No. I'm happy to be here. And thank you for the invitation. My name is Ken Davidson, he, him. I work for the US EPA in a couple of capacities. I am located in our Region 9 office in San Francisco, and where I provide air toxics risk assessment and mobile source air quality support to our air and radiation division. I also work for the Office of Transportation and Air Quality for EPA headquarters, looking at the health effects of our regulatory approaches to reducing pollution from mobile sources. And I have worked for a number of years with my colleague, Rich Baldoff, who also works for the Office of Transportation and Air Quality and our Office of Research at EPA, who is the true expert on vegetation barriers. And I just write his coattails, but I've been working on vegetation barrier research for a few years. And we actually worked with a school, Brookfield Elementary in Oakland, to assist in the design and planting of a vegetation barrier there that was accompanied by a pre-existing sound barrier. We also found a location in the Detroit area in a park to also install vegetation barriers, and that research is ongoing. But I'm happy to be here to help answer questions and provide more information to the extent I'm able. So thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Ken. That's expertise that we need in this area, and we all work together to get this idea of using planting trees to improve air pollution and reduce emissions in what is an emissions reduction plan. And so demonstrating that there is a scientific benefit, because I personally don't need one, but I understand why it helps for justifying this funding source. How do we evaluate that? And so, for starters, I think it's probably easiest to track PM 2.5 levels. And I've shared with this group, but so I'll share with you that my organization, Little Manila, is doing a pretty high density citywide PM 2.5 characterization study with UC Merced School of Public Health. Or they're not a school, there's some division over there, under a Department of Justice contract. And of course, the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District will be collecting really high quality PM 2.5 data at 7 different monitoring sites within the study area. How those data points inform, descriptions around the dispersion of PM 2.5 remains a question. I do have a technical partner that will be creating a dispersion model for South Stockton, but that won't be up and running until later this summer. There's potential to be able to look back at that data. With sort of the inadequate data set of the past, the limited funding that we have, and our need to move forward with some degree of confidence that planting trees is good for people, we've talked about sort of picking either a high value project nearest a freeway where we know that, hopefully you can corroborate this or correct me, vegetative barriers are much more effective when they're near the emitting facility versus trying to capture the PM, a 1.5 miles away from the freeway at the actual school site. And so that was at least an ideal goal that I have had, but right of access doesn't always seem to be easy to get with California freeways. And so as an alternative strategy, we may have to settle for a dense encircling buffer at this school site where we do have some indoor and outdoor air quality that could be described as baseline from before any sort of urban greening programs there. So trying to look at how do we evaluate, how do we think about those 2 potential opportunities. So that's it. And so we have Scott, you brought your friends here. I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer what they're here to share, but I'm happy to take notes here in the agenda, which hopefully everybody has access to.
Well, I'm happy to give a few initial thoughts, and that can maybe help spur the discussion. But and also, please, forgive me for coming into this late, so I don't know a lot of the specifics of
it's okay. You missed all the fun.
I've missed all the fun that the committee has had preceding to or before today's discussion. You know, there is a growing amount of literature that does demonstrate the effectiveness of well-planned vegetation barriers in terms of disrupting and dispersing the air pollutants that are coming from near road sources, factoring in a number of considerations such as wind direction, if the barrier is placed, you know, as perpendicular as possible to the prevailing wind direction coming from the source, from a near road source. The width and porosity of the vegetation barrier is very important. It's not as much emission reductions as it is a dilution and mixing tool. There is some deposition or absorption depending on the species and their the vegetation leaf or needle type, but that's a small amount compared to the dilution effect that barriers have. I would really recommend, you know, vegetation barriers work right next to the plume or the source of the pollution. So you would want to give a little more thought to that distance question, because it's from where, say, next to a road, that dilution really is within a certain established distance. Before then, it kind of goes back to the background levels of what pollution would be at a certain distance past the vegetation barrier. There isn't a lot of, the literature is very rich in terms of the health impacts from pollution near sources of traffic pollution. There is not a lot of the same literature directly tied to vegetation barriers, and it is not an easy research question to solve to answer in a setting such as the growth of a new vegetation barrier. The interesting research question can often be, you know, what are the novel elements of the considerations that are going into the design and building of your vegetation barrier, and how is that going to impact pollution levels before and after the barrier has been planted. And that also needs a carefully designed monitoring study to get the right distances and locations of those monitors and the pollution that's being sampled both before and after the vegetation barrier is in place. And my last thing before I ramble on too long, and I just noticed Lily has her hand up, so I apologize for not seeing that earlier. And that is the time lag that you do need to account for between the planning and then planting of your vegetation barrier, and when you're going to get a full signal of what the downwind concentrations are like once that vegetation barrier is in place and mature and has the characteristics of an effective barrier. So some of those, you can mitigate some of that by planting more mature vegetation, but that vegetation also has to be with the least amount of porosity as possible. You do not want gaps in the vegetation barrier, and so that takes careful planning, maintenance, and the amount of time to get the vegetation to where it needs to be. So I will pause there. That's kind of my intro spiel.
Yeah, that was perfect. You actually touched on a lot of questions. You know, I've said things that I've heard, but I'm a history teacher. So maybe, you know, understandably people wanted to hear it from somebody else. And it was, you know, it was good to hear you corroborate some of the hearsay we've had in these meetings. Lily, what would you like to share with us, please?
Definitely echo a lot of what Ken shared. I think that for the body of literature that has showed there is a connection by reducing exposure to air pollution, it does benefit health, but there is a missing gap piece there in that PM 2.5 is a type of air pollution that is a complex mixture. And so to just make that connection, despite there being middle gaps in between reducing exposure and the health benefits that might come from that, is a completely different ball of wax that, you know, our biomonitoring program kind of seeks to address, but without having that adequately addressed and understanding the composition of PM 2.5, it's really hard to see specific health benefits. So recognizing that SERP actions have, you know, limited benefit for what they are at this point in time, and recognizing that it needs regulation changing for getting at the emission sources to be reduced. Per what Ken said, the exposure reduction does help as our intermediate action as we get at emission sources coming down. So that is a missing piece to tie the health that is, I hear, you know, the primary concern in many communities, but to actually address that, it does take time. And in the meantime, the vegetative barriers will help reduce exposure to said emissions.
Gotcha. Thanks for that distinction that there's a lot of particles in the air, but it really matters what those particles are. And so just saying generically that what an array of purple air finds, and if they plummet, did health improve because that plummeted? I think, Lily, if I were to say, I bet you a lot of this PM 2.5 that's just to the right of our freeway down the windrows from a freeway and a port corridor that's full of heavy duty diesel truck traffic, that a reduction in a pollution solution like that, it would be safe to say would be a good thing to want for anybody's kids who are downwind. And we can say that diesel particulate matter is bad for terrestrial humans. Okay, great. I mean, I'm looking for arguments to make sure that, you know, everybody tracks that there's no healthy level of pollution in any human body. And with that, I'll clam up and point to Mr. Brian Moore, and then I see Mary next in the queue.
Mary, you can go first if you'd like.
Thank you. So I just had a question and was wondering if in our monitoring plan, I believe that we had some speciation of constituents of concern.
We do. At select sites, we have speciation of both VOCs and PM 2.5. And one of those sites is that big, huge trailer that we're going to deploy that will do both of those things. And that's the site in the Boggs Tract area near the community center, near Washington Elementary.
Okay, just quick follow up on that. That trailer may or may not be capturing wind drift from 5 and 4 though at that location. So just something for folks to keep in mind, since we got pretty predictable windrows here.
I can say though, we can, to that point though, that is definitely a great reminder. And yes, we have a pretty predictable pattern. If we do feel like, okay, that's not going to capture it, that speciation equipment can be deployed as needed and connected to that van, which is the critical reason of having a van, right? Yeah. The only caveat that you all know of, and especially Little Manila is super helpful with, is anytime we do that, it needs to be parked for like a set amount of time, and it's a big, expensive piece of equipment. So it usually means finding a location, but maybe that location is, you know, Little Manila is on, you know, maybe the proper
yeah.
other places.
Or All Saints itself.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jess. Go ahead, Brian.
Oh, just to comment on the idea that that PM 2.5, when we measure it, that's just size-based, right? It doesn't say what type of stuff's in there, just like what Lily said and Jessica said, which is a weakness of a lot of studies. But if another way you look at it, when you look at the vast amount of literature out there that's just measured size, there's a strong, consistent correlation between, like, let's say premature death and just particles underneath that size, right? Regardless, you know, in California, across the world, you know, there's this really consistent relationship. So yes, it's a weakness that we don't know exactly what's in it, but then the evidence is that regardless of what's in it, we do see some very strong relationships to health impacts.
I'm on mute. Anybody have anything jumping out at anybody? I mean, so I'm hearing that even though PM 2.5 remains sort of a peculiar question mark when it comes to specific public health claims, we could justifiably suggest that reducing particulate matter is I would find that, instead I'll stop speaking for everybody else, I would find that a positive argument in favor of establishing vegetative barriers. And so just curious to hear, well, Jess, I see your hand, so I'll stop being curious.
No, I'm curious to also hear from other committee members. I'll save my comment after you finish your.
Well, okay. Well, I mean, you know, and this is something that Ned and I have talked about for a while, because Ned's been a real champion of investing in these trees in our community. And at the same time, you know, show us the benefit in some sort of measurable metric that proves that this public money is being spent appropriately on the purpose for which it was allocated. So Ned, even if, you know, understanding that there are variables, confounding variables within the PM solution in our airshed, would you join a project that was interested in tracking its success based on particulate matter levels?
Well, of course, you know, I'd like to hear from, I think it's Susan Hurley. I think it's quite important, the study that is, I thought there was going to be a continuation of FACES and CHAPS, that type of really good study in our area. And I'd like to hear what is planned for what I used to call St. George's School. I guess it's now the All Saints Academy. And I do think there's opportunity to do some studies around Washington School. So I'd like to hear what the studies are and how that may help us understand the relationship and hopefully the benefits from vegetative barriers and urban greening.
Well, let's see. I can't speak to CHAPS or FACES. Those are studies that I'm not involved in.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so those are, you know, Betsy Noth at UC Berkeley and Asa Bradman. Well, Betsy Noth I know was involved with both of those. So I can give you her contact information. She's at UC Berkeley. Now, she was a collaborator on the Stockton study. So maybe that's where you're thinking I was involved in that also. And then in terms of the Stockton air filtration study at All Saints Academy, you know, we're still, the labs are still conducting the analysis, both of the biomonitoring data in the urine and then also some of the air sampling data. So we don't have any answers yet, and it'll still be several months. But we are continuing to engage with the school there to make sure that as part of our study, we did have like an HVAC evaluation done there where they could improve, you know, where we identified some areas that they could do improvements. We also left behind some of those standalone filtration units, as well as purple air monitors, as Matt was saying, indoors and outdoors at the school. So there is some continuing air monitoring indoors and outdoors that's going on. We did during the actual urine collection phase of the study, which was very short, we did collect some other more sort of fancy air monitoring and sampling that gets a little bit more at sources. But that would be very, you know, it's such a short period of time. I don't think it'll be very useful for even setting kind of baseline data for air quality around there. And then the biomarkers, you know, were useful in the context of that study because, well, so the biomarkers that we looked at were biomarkers that indicate exposures to PAH, so polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and VOCs, volatile organic compounds, which many of the sources come from traffic-related pollutants, but they're not specific to that in particular. So in order to be able to interpret our results, we had to collect all this complementary air monitoring data. We had to do surveys with the parents. So to do that kind of study in the context of trying to evaluate vegetative barriers would be, it would take a long time to plan, it would be expensive. And I'm not sure it would really give us anything beyond what just a little bit better air monitoring or some air monitoring data would give us.
Okay, so just, I guess I didn't understand what was cooking here. I thought, gee, this really wonderful, I mean, it seemed like a pretty good study, that FACES study, and CHAPS was going to take off on that. And we're going to try to apply something like that here in Stockton, because there's some, it seems to me like there's some really big questions. I strongly support vegetative barriers and urban greening intrinsically, and I think they will show some benefits just like ventilation. But because I think that is not the same thing as having good studies that will show and demonstrate and maybe even quantify the cost and benefits. Sounds to me like you may not be around for when we might even get the vegetative barriers and see what health effects are and whatever. This is a sort of a short-term study. I guess we should know the study specifications. I guess we just don't even have, I mean, I don't have that. It's not, it sounds like it's quite a bit different than what I was hoping for, I suppose, but doesn't mean it isn't great, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I wouldn't say I'm not going to be around. I mean, I'm with OEHA, and my role is to help support research that helps support the goals of AB 617. We don't not have, I'm not part of the FACES project, which I know they are starting up again. They're starting another round of data collection, but I don't know any of the details of that.
Okay, let me just frame my concerns. I said I'm intrinsically for vegetative barriers, urban greening, FACES. You know, this is the conclusion from FACES. Really, it seemed to me you should have a bunch of double-blind randomized studies, and there's an indictment here because there aren't those, because then we could put a lot of this to rest. So you have a lot of these kind of weak observational studies from what I can see here. And indulge me, this is a one minute recitation from FACES. Among the pollutants that have received the most attention in recent years is particulate matter. However, there's a paucity of data on which components of the complex PM mixture produce those effects, and no data on the relationship between the responses to short-term exposure and the long-term progression of asthma in children, which I think is very important. Furthermore, few studies have specifically looked at the effects of PM in the context of the complex exposures people experience outdoors and indoors. Exposures that include not only the external pollutants, but the biologically active agents such as endotoxins, fungal spores, pollens, and common indoor allergens. The conclusion: to date, the results of the analyses of exposure to PM 2.5 and lung function have not demonstrated an association. There's a basis for some skepticism here. There's a basis for having good studies. And so that's my concern, that whatever we do in spending money for any of the so-called emission reductions, but certainly my favorite, the urban greening and the vegetative barriers, let's see if we can get some measures to address these fundamental questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ned. I see Jessica's hand and then Lily.
Yeah, and maybe Lily, were you going to directly address something that, or just kind of globally? Yeah, I'll let Lily go first, and then I'd like to, yeah.
Thanks, Jess. I caution against taking a quote from a scientific study and putting it out somewhat out of context. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm saying that the caveats that come with a study without fully understanding its application are problematic at times, kind of like now where we're talking about PM 2.5. That has been established as a complex mixture. That doesn't mean that we don't know that there are health effects, because particularly with the size, we know that the smaller a particle is, the more it can get into your lungs. Even in the COVID pandemic, we found that, you know, people who have pre-existing conditions, lung, asthma, respiratory distress as a whole are more predisposed just because they have pre-existing conditions. Size matters in this instance. And so the smaller it is, the more it can get into your lungs and cause health problems. With trying to take, a complex mixture and draw universal health effects, there's problems with that too, because of the different composition of what makes up PM 2.5. So for example, at the diesel particulate matter, which was mentioned, that the traffic pollution, that is pretty much any community in California, just because of how our land use practices have happened, we have traffic pollution everywhere. Where it gets more complicated is, are communities urban or are they agricultural? Those also feed in different components into our PM 2.5 mixtures. And so with that complication of, we got an urban community versus like an agricultural one, the PM 2.5s won't be the same in those kind of communities. And so I think what's helpful, at least from my statewide perspective, is trying to see what's similar amongst communities, what's different amongst communities. At this early point in time, we know PM 2.5 is not healthy for anyone. It's air pollution. And per Matt's point, it's like, there's no healthy amount. There is a safe amount, but even that we take with a grain of salt. So I think to the point of, if this is helpful, there are studies that show vegetative barriers help reduce exposure. By reducing exposure to air pollution, we downstream help protect our health. There's a whole bunch in the middle that we're not addressing without further advancing of our science. And that is like, our biomonitoring studies to figure out speciation, to figure out like what composition, what's the most toxic in that composition. And those kind of things will take time to figure out.
Thanks. Go ahead, Jessica.
I was just going to further one of the points that Lily said, and I think just to move us forward and kind of the urgency, I'm thinking my job, right, is to implement the SERP and work with you all on how we can move measures forward, and sort of, now hearing from the experts on ground truthing what we thought we knew when we put this in the SERP. We intentionally, as a committee, allocated $1 million for this and for urban greening in the SERP, with the understanding that this would improve health, and with the understanding that urban greening would help, limit heat islands and provide other benefits to the community. And so with that, I think I would look to you, Matt, to see kind of, obviously not necessarily at this meeting, but as we move forward, to, I think what you were getting at earlier, maybe kind of coming to like a general consensus that we think, we're agreeing that we put this in the SERP last year, still seems like we want it. Then how do we now take the next step and move forward and get as many trees planted as possible?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. I mean, Ned, we're in a research arms race, and we lost a couple decades ago. And we got a ton of work that we need to do if we're ever going to get things underway. But I see a queue now, so go ahead, Ken, and then I have Margot, and then Ned.
Great, thanks. And I'll just be brief, but the type of pollution that a near road vegetation barrier is meant to disrupt and dilute is well documented as having a wide variety of health effects, and not only through EPA's integrated science assessments, but the Health Effects Institute has a big literature on near traffic air pollution and the health effects that are associated with it. So just keep in mind that because of the proximity of the barriers to the pollution it's meant to disrupt, that's the connection that we can make to the health effects that would be associated with disrupting that air pollution. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Sorry, thank you, Margot.
Hi. I really appreciate that Ned has been so constant in talking about the health effects of everything we do, wanting to know the difference it makes. And knowing that determining health effects as focused on a single issue does take years. It does take time. And I hope that some of those studies are going to be done. I think that at our level, what we may be looking at is vigorously monitoring the air quality in the areas where we put up vegetative monitoring or vegetative barriers, excuse me. And I expect we should see results. You know, it would be questionable if we saw no results. So that would be my hope. And I don't know if we need to, if this needs to be coordinated with the camp subcommittee or anything like that, or with the people involved in where the air monitoring is. So when projects get designed, that gets taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. And just check as I try to type some of these notes in for what you just said. And go ahead, Ned.
Okay, is it my turn? Look, I think we're all on the same page. We want to have vegetative barriers. We want to have urban greening. Let's try and get some monitors close to them so we can see the changes. It would be nice if we could have some real determine if we're having some health effects here, because look, my toxicologist friends say the poison is in the dose. We're in a situation where in Stockton, we're below the EPA standards for PM 2.5. If we reduce PM 2.5 exposure by 4 micrograms per meter cubed, are we going to get any health benefits? I don't know. But at least here, let's try to see what the exposure reduction is, and let's see if we can see if there's some health benefits. Now, the other thing is, what's the cost of a reduction in exposure, not emissions, exposure? We want to, if you're concerned about exposure to a criterion pollutant, you want to get the most exposure for the least cost. We should deploy urban, greening and vegetative barriers in such a way as we can do these measurements, and we should strive to be able to make a positive statement. I think we can, whether it's ventilation or those other measures about human health. And let me leave you with this. Okay, someone brought up the COVID studies, the vaccine studies. I encourage everyone to take a look at the New England Journal of Medicine, December 2020 study that supported the safety and the effectiveness of the Pfizer vaccine. That's a double-blind randomized study. As soon as you have that for PM 2.5, I will not be a skeptic. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ned. And I think the dose matters, and I certainly don't want to waste time planting trees when if maybe it's time for everyone who lives in Stockton to hide in their kitchen behind an air cleaner. But I think I hear you. We just don't have. Unfortunately, we have $1 million for this strategy that has to last for 10 years, and we have to figure out how to spend it soon. And so I think as much as the science remains, there remain some questions, and maybe this project can be a part of answering some of those questions. And I think that's a potential strategy that we can use to open this up and invite partners, because there are other CARB and OEHA studies happening in Stockton in the coming years. And even though things should be designed strategically from the beginning, maybe there are braiding opportunities around this vegetative barrier strategy, just as there are other significant urban forestry strategies that could pump blood or tree sap into this idea, and to help make this 10 years of maintenance funding, as meaningful as possible. Mary Elizabeth, I see your hand. Sorry.
Thank you. So this link here that Brian put in regarding Ken also includes consideration of noise. And I just, while you're here, folks that have been working on the mitigating effects of vegetation, is there any effect on noise as well? Just kind of a random question. And then lastly, I do want to emphasize and support what Margot had to say in regards to robust monitoring. So if we have, very robust monitoring, and down the road some health benefits are achieved, through some other study, even in a different area, we're going to be able to apply those results better if we have excellent monitoring data. So if that's something that we can get, then that's what I think we should do.
Yeah, Mary Elizabeth, you reading my emails or something? Because there are studies that will be looking at potential correlation between sound pollution and PM dispersion and PM infiltration into homes right here in this study area with some pretty solid folks implementing that. So there's certainly potential to learn about that overlap. Yeah, Jessica, go ahead.
I was just going to offer, it's maybe more of a next step. So Ken, I don't know if he was going to answer the sound pollution piece, so I'll let him answer that.
Okay, great. And the noise, right. So there is a lot of research on the effectiveness of solid barriers for sound that are built, you know, in terms of disrupting pollution, and to a lesser degree, but also, you know, there are noise benefits of vegetation barriers. But I just wanted to remind folks, because you may have already talked about this in previous meetings, but if you haven't, there are a number of other co-benefits that can be measured from vegetation barriers, including temperature, stormwater control, among two of the biggies. So if you can factor those into the discussion as well when tracking the benefits of vegetation barriers, and those are other things that can be measured and quantified.
Awesome, thank you.
I was going to offer, I wonder if, because it sounds, I know based on kind of some of the things that have been brought up, especially Mary Elizabeth and Margot's point, which I think adds to some of Ned's concerns. I wonder if we can work together, the district and you and Clifton, on like a little sketch of like, okay, if we were to deploy this at this place, this is where we already plan on having monitoring. This is what we think we could do, and use as sort of like an outline of maybe we already have all this in place and we're kind of talking around each other. And it seems, to your point, there's already going to be monitoring deployed. There's already, you know, plans for where we think vegetative barriers make sense. Maybe visualizing it at our next meeting will help folks feel like, okay, there is going to be some of these answers, and that can help us maybe fill in the gaps. Maybe we identify, oh, what if we just added one more monitoring piece here, did something else here, or used Matt's great tool with his other research buddies here, and this can all kind of come in together. I think that just visually would help us.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Brian, didn't you have your hand up for a second? No?
Oh, I did. I just don't want to take up any more of your time, but the co-benefits question I think is great, because we always talk about cost benefits analysis, but that really is dependent on what you are able to capture as a cost and a benefit. We were looking at some studies at CAR that showed like vegetative barriers, a co-benefit could be that a better looking street with vegetation along it would encourage people to walk. They're getting exercise, and you'll see cardiovascular benefits from that. So yeah, a large umbrella to capture all the co-benefits is helpful. You know, there could be a lot of co-benefits outside of just air pollution exposure reduction.
Yeah, I've found a really interesting tidbit about Caltrans graffiti abatement budgets, and nobody spray paints a wall covered in ivy, and that there are ways to sort of pivot some of those older strategies into these types of strategies. Ken, you know, so it sounds like we're all game to try this. And I think what really remains is, how do we do this with the amount of funding that we have? How much more funding and research partners do we need to answer some of these bigger questions? But you know, Ken, before we lose you in the next 9 minutes, you know, we're going to be monitoring for PM 2.5. There's going to be robust VOC and black carbon going on with the air district. I know CARB will be doing some indoor ozone and sound pollution studies, all really in roughly the same area. What about monitoring for other things like ultrafine particles coming away from transportation sources? Is there a way for us to look at our community air monitoring plan, forgive me, and say what's missing from that I as a third party could supplement that further adds definition to the argument for or against vegetative barriers?
I'd want to think about an answer to that question a little bit more, from what I've heard today, I think you're targeting the correct pollutants, right? The markers of traffic-related pollution is what you want to track in terms of the effectiveness of how a barrier is affecting downwind air quality. and at different distances from that barrier. So
you said markers of traffic pollution?
Right, like black carbon is often one. If you're not looking at PM 2.5, black carbon, we've done that in a number of our studies. We have used some monitors for NO2 for the gaseous portions of traffic pollution as well. And I think most importantly too is the design of your sampling collection both before and after in the location of your vegetation barrier. So you'd want to get good transects at different, perpendicular to the downwind portion of your barrier, different distances. You want to do a lot of sampling around the edges of your vegetation barrier to get a sense of what the signals look there. And then you want to make sure you're getting the right distances, both close to and further away from your vegetation barrier to get a full picture.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that there's a lot of opportunities to do really creative monitoring here, and people are interested in our problems, which I think is a good sign for Stockton's future. With the time that we have left, and Ken, we'll circle back to you on some of that stuff, but for the time that we have left, I want to talk about this RFP, which is sort of the working edge of us getting anything done on this, and that we have to make sure that we want these trees to be alive for as long as possible. It's reasonable that a performance period for something like this is 10 years. There are challenges around doing a vegetative barrier in a state-owned right-of-way. Caltrans has a bureaucratic relationship with cities and counties where it allows them to maintain their land, but it doesn't allow Joe Public to maintain land without paying a fee. And so, it's difficult in a city like Stockton that it's got a corporation yard for 400 and some odd people. It's got 80 folks showing up to work in it across 7 days of scheduling. So totally understaffed, and the city's not going to commit to maintaining vegetative barriers long-term. That said, my organization is in a contract with the city to build pretty robust urban forestry programs in South Stockton. And that may be a way to complement this AB 617 money. And it really should just be the city, amending its resources to maintain these budgets or this practice down here. So if we were able to get into that proximal space, that Caltrans setback, that's one potential way, which is for the city and community forestry programs to supply the trees and the labor for the installation costs and the design costs, but that some of these AB 617 funds could live with the city as an in-kind contribution to those, every biannual, semi-annual, one of those that means 2 years, grant awards that they're able to get. So as it stands right now, there is a major project that has funding for thousands of trees within the project area, and we have actually mapped overlap between TCC and where did it go? TCC zones. Oh, there it is. Between the TCC project where the city has funding and where the AB 617 project is restrained. So I'll just drop this image in here about potential places where we know there are sensitive populations. I'll share my screen real quick, but you guys can all take a copy of that. But you can see here that there are properties right alongside the freeway. And then there's, this odd little map is how you get 5 square miles that prioritize residential households. And there's really a lot of interest around vegetative barrier here under Highway 4. And then of course, these east sides of I-5 that would be downwind from the most vehicle traffic before it hits our most polluted communities. By the same token, you got Conway Homes here, and Highway 4 isn't that crazy of traffic, but you got the port over ramp and I-5 up here, and then all the stationary sources clustered at the Port of Stockton. So there may be potential vegetative barriers here on the north side of all this. So there's some stone soup that could be made out here. I think that's a whole other conversation. But I wanted to share that there's there's a way to plant a tree right now within this 10-year maintenance requirement under AB 617, because nothing can be funded for 10 years for $1 million unless you want to plant a tree in my kitchen window. And I'll take care of it for 10 years. But with that terrible joke, I will pass it to Mr. Aaron Tarango.
Yeah, just something real quick. You know, I think the one we shared was the RFP for urban greening, because we anticipate that the RFP for vegetative barriers would be a little different. So I want to make sure we're distinctively, they are going to be different type of criteria. So
thanks.
You know,
I was conflating. I assume that the maintenance requirement is a transitory requirement of the state.
It is, but where you vegetative barriers, how you install those, and the people who do it versus trees in the city, those are different RFPs. We want different. Might be the same person, but different people to do those. So somebody,
yeah,
there's gonna be 2 separate RFPs we issue for those, I think.
Gotcha. Thanks for clarifying. So we got 2 more minutes left. That doesn't mean we have to open up a new can of worms, but I think that thank you for this meeting and helping us sort of put a finer point on there may be loose ends to vegetative barriers and public health benefits, but at the very least, there are very generic benefits and co-benefits that we can confidently define and try to track, and that this is something that we need to find a way to proceed. And so I think we need to talk about how do we intersect the long-term maintenance and the amount of funding that we have, and it may be a gap assessment and how much funding we would need to install a vegetative barrier that to the scale of our problem, and what that additional funding would look like and where it could come from. So that's my recommendation for a next agenda, but I'm happy to hear more. And I see hands up from Mary Elizabeth and Alejandra.
Yeah, I just have a quick one. So our next meeting, we're going to talk about the RFP for urban greening.
No, that's the RFP that we've currently discussed. It was around urban greening, but that's a lot more flexible as far as the placement. And they're really, I personally think we're going to need to use the urban greening contract for, one of those receptor site type barriers. Doesn't have to be called a vegetative barrier, but we could plant that around All Saints Academy and cool it and try to knock down PM infiltration there. Or we could decide that there's a corridor through the city that represents big urban heat island benefits from a targeted planting of the urban greening $1 million. The vegetative barriers, we haven't finished that RFP, but we do have this sort of looming question about how we can prove that a vegetative barrier strategy works. So we kind of shifted ponies between the last 2 meetings and this one. And maybe that's my fault for not defining the meeting better.
Aaron, this RFP that we got a few days ago included a lot of contract language. Are we going to have any opportunity to discuss that?
Yeah, that's the purpose of this is some comments and feedback on, this is the starting point, is to get the feedback. Make sure we're hitting the right targets and going the right direction.
I wonder, Matt, maybe we reserve, just so folks have a little more time to put thoughts together, we can reserve 15 minutes at the end of the next meeting after we resolve some of the other lingering issues to hear verbal feedback. But if in between you have written feedback, we're also open to that much sooner if you have something put together. Yeah, and maybe given time, we can high level walk you through if there's questions just in general. I know we kind of don't have time today. But walk you through some of that language.
Yeah, I think now that we've kind of addressed this issue, why don't we have the next meeting be about a collective read through of the RFP, the imminent ones.
Yeah, sounds great.
So, and on that note, since we're already over time, we generally do this on the same bat channel once a month, and so that would be looking like the 3rd Tuesday of June. And I always get this, or 3rd Tuesday of May, because it's still April?
Still April. It's still April.
May 17th. Hallelujah. Still 2022, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I've been in my garage this whole time. So, okay, cool. So unless we need to, I don't think we need to mess with that. we have a somewhat brighter future for trees in Stockton. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great meeting.